Winter arrived early that year, the kind of winter that didn't politely knock, but kicked the door down overnight. By 6:30 in the morning, my driveway was buried under nearly 8 inches of heavy, wet snow. The kind that turns shovels into instruments of torture and makes plows cry for mercy. I had work at 9. My wife had a hospital shift, and the HOA bylaws clearly stated residents were responsible for keeping driveways and sidewalks clear before business hours. I checked the local noise ordinance, same as every winter, and confirmed that snow removal equipment was allowed starting at 7 a.m. sharp. So when the clock flipped from 6:59 to 7:00, I pulled the cord on my snowblower and let it roar to life. The sound echoed softly through the neighborhood, a mechanical growl mixed with the crunch of ice being hurled aside. It was peaceful in its own way, methodical, necessary, legal. I wasn't trying to be loud, I wasn't being careless, and I certainly wasn't trying to wake anyone. I was just a homeowner doing what needed to be done. I had barely finished the first pass when I saw movement at the edge of my vision. A porch light snapped on across the street, followed by the unmistakable silhouette of someone standing with arms crossed. Moments later, my phone buzzed with a notification from the HOA group chat. Before I could even check it, I heard heels clicking against frozen pavement. She marched across the snow like she owned the ground beneath her boots. The woman was well known in our community, though never by name. Everyone simply called her HOA Karen. She stopped at the edge of my driveway, glaring as if I had personally offended her ancestors. I shut off the snowblower, partly out of courtesy and partly out of curiosity. She wasted no time. She told me I was violating community peace, disturbing residents, and breaking HOA rules by operating heavy machinery so early in the morning. I calmly told her it was 7 a.m. exactly, and that both city ordinances and HOA guidelines allowed snow removal at that hour. She scoffed, waved her hand dismissively, and said she didn't care what the city said because the HOA had authority here. I reminded her that she was not on the HOA board and had no enforcement power. That's when her face hardened. She informed me she was acting on behalf of the HOA and ordered me to stop immediately or face consequences. The word ordered was emphasized, dripping with entitlement. I felt irritation creeping up my spine, but I stayed polite. I told her again that I was within my legal rights and that I needed to clear my driveway for work. She leaned closer and said she would report me, fine me, and make sure I regretted being disrespectful. Then she pointed at the shared access road that ran behind our properties, a gravel strip everyone used to reach garages and trash pickup. She told me that road existed only because the HOA allowed it, and they could take it away if they wanted. That was the moment something clicked in my head. I remembered the paperwork from when I bought the house. I remembered the easement clause, the one the HOA liked to pretend didn't exist. I looked at her, smiled politely, and said, "We'll see." She huffed, turned around dramatically, and stomped back through the snow, already tapping furiously on her phone. I restarted the snowblower and finished clearing my driveway, but my mind was no longer on the snow. It was on that easement, that thin strip of legal ground that the HOA relied on but never respected. By the time I shut the machine off, I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. By the time I got back inside, my phone was buzzing nonstop. HOA group messages were lighting up like a Christmas tree, each notification more dramatic than the last. According to Karen, I had engaged in hostile behavior, violated quiet enjoyment, and refused a lawful directive from a community representative. The language was laughably inflated, but I knew better than to dismiss it. When HOAs decide they're right, they rarely stop at words. Sure enough, later that afternoon, an official-looking email landed in my inbox with the HOA letterhead proudly displayed at the top. It stated that I was being issued a warning for noise violations and informed me that continued noncompliance could result in fines, suspension of community privileges, and restricted access to shared amenities. The part that caught my attention was a single sentence buried near the bottom. It mentioned that access to the rear service road was a revocable privilege granted by the HOA. I laughed out loud when I read that, not because it was funny, but because it was wrong. Very wrong. That road wasn't a privilege. It was an easement, recorded with the county decades before the HOA even existed. They relied on it for trash trucks, emergency access, and utilities, but somehow convinced themselves it belonged to them. I pulled out my closing documents and flipped straight to the page I remembered. There it was in black and white, a perpetual easement granted to the property owners, not the HOA, for ingress and egress along the rear access road. No revocation clause, no HOA authority, just a legally binding right. I also remembered a conversation with the previous owner, who warned me the HOA liked to bluff. They counted on people not knowing their rights. I decided I wouldn't be one of those people. That evening, another message came through. This time it was from Karen directly, not the HOA account. She told me the board was very unhappy, and that if I didn't apologize and agree to stop snowblowing before 8 a.m., they would take action. She ended the message with a smiley face, as if that softened the threat. I replied calmly, stating that I had broken no rules and that any attempt to interfere with my property rights would be challenged. Minutes later, she fired back, saying I was being combative and that the HOA was considering enforcement options regarding the easement. That was my final confirmation that they had no idea what they were dealing with. The next morning, I noticed something new. Cones. Bright orange traffic cones blocking the entrance to the rear access road behind my house. A laminated sign zip-tied to one of them read "Road closed by order of HOA." My garage opened onto that road. My trash bins were collected from there. Blocking it wasn't just petty, it was disruptive. I took photos, documented everything, and called the city. They informed me that the HOA had no authority to close a recorded easement and suggested I speak to a property attorney. I did exactly that. The attorney reviewed my documents and confirmed what I already knew. The HOA was overstepping, and badly. He explained that not only could I challenge their action, but I could also formally revoke the HOA's permissive use of the easement for anything beyond the original scope. In simple terms, I could legally restrict their access while preserving my own. That idea sat heavy in my mind. I didn't want revenge, but I also wasn't going to be bullied. When the HOA tried to flex power they didn't have, they handed me leverage they never expected me to use. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA. Inside was a formal notice stating that due to my continued defiance, the board had voted to fine me $100 per day until I complied with revised quiet hour guidelines. They also claimed authority to regulate use of the rear access road and warned me against unauthorized travel. That letter was the moment I stopped trying to be reasonable. I forwarded everything to my attorney, including photos, emails, messages, and copies of the HOA's claims. His response was immediate and confident. He told me the HOA had crossed multiple legal lines and that it was time to respond officially. We drafted a letter together, one that cited the recorded easement, the lack of HOA authority, and the improper closure of a legally protected access route. But we didn't stop there. The letter also included a notice of revocation. While the easement granted property owners rights, the HOA's use of the road for non-essential purposes, like storage, signage, and patrol vehicles, had only ever existed by informal permission. Permission I was now withdrawing. The notice stated that effective immediately, HOA representatives were prohibited from using the easement for any purpose beyond emergency access and utility maintenance. No patrols, no signs, no cones, no intimidation. When that letter went out, things escalated fast. Karen showed up at my door that evening, red-faced and furious, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. I calmly told her to leave my property and communicate through legal channels only. She threatened lawsuits, liens, and community sanctions. I repeated myself and closed the door. The next morning, the cones were gone. So were the signs. A day later, the HOA sent another email, this time noticeably more polite. They claimed there had been a misunderstanding regarding the easement and said they were reviewing legal interpretations. Meanwhile, trash pickup was delayed because the HOA had been using the rear road to stage bins, something they could no longer do. Residents started asking questions. Why were services disrupted? Why were HOA vehicles no longer allowed back there? Whispers spread, and for the first time, the HOA wasn't controlling the narrative. A week later, a special board meeting was announced. I attended attorney on speakerphone. The board tried to save face, stating that the situation had been blown out of proportion. My attorney responded by calmly outlining every violation, every threat, and every false claim they had made. He explained the consequences of continuing, including potential lawsuits for interference with property rights. The room went quiet. Karen sat rigid, arms crossed, refusing to make eye contact. The board voted that night to rescind the fines, issue a written apology, and formally acknowledge the easement rights of property owners. They also amended their guidelines to align with city noise ordinances, explicitly allowing snow removal starting at 7 a.m. The meeting ended with no applause, no drama, just stunned silence. As I walked out, I realized something important. This had never been about snow. It had been about control. And the moment they tried to exert power they didn't legally have, they lost it entirely. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood changed in subtle but noticeable ways. HOA emails became shorter, more carefully worded, and noticeably less aggressive. The group chat went quiet, especially from Karen, who seemed to vanish overnight. People who had barely spoken to me before started nodding, waving, even stopping to say thanks. A few admitted they'd been fined or threatened in the past but never knew they could push back. The rear access road remained open, clean, and peaceful, now free of cones, signs, and unnecessary patrols. Snow came again later that winter, heavier than before. At exactly 7 a.m., I started my snowblower, same as always. This time, no porch light snapped on, no heels clicked toward my driveway, no angry messages followed, just the sound of snow clearing and a neighborhood waking up to a fresh start. Karen eventually sold her house. Rumor had it she didn't like the new lack of enforcement. The HOA never mentioned her again. As for me, I didn't become some anti-HOA crusader. I didn't sue, didn't gloat, didn't escalate further. I simply exercised my rights and made it clear I wouldn't be bullied. That was enough. The lesson wasn't about winning. It was about knowing where authority ends and law begins. HOAs rely on intimidation, confusion, and silence. They thrive when people assume rules are absolute and questions are dangerous. But the truth is simpler. Documents matter. Laws matter. And standing your ground, calmly and legally, can shift an entire balance of power. Every winter since, I still check the clock before starting my Snowblower, not because I'm afraid, but because I respect my neighbors. Respect, however, goes both ways. And once you remind people of that, they tend to listen.